want to build over here on the Maumee side of the river, except that the logistics of the stuff coming up from the south would have been one more obstacle to overcome. So he decided on building it here on the south bank of the river. Here's Fort Meigs here, and it's set up on this high bluff along the Maumee River, and this bluff will sort of play into what goes on later on. So here we are down here in Columbus. Here's Fort Meigs up in near Perrysburg, Ohio, just outside Toledo. Now this is a geophysical map of the state of Ohio, and this sort of elongated green spot is the remnants of the old fossil lake bed of Lake Erie when it was quite larger. The result of that is that this whole area was something known as the Great Black Swamp. That you could get in, and it wasn't just a swamp like you see the Everglades. It was a whole series of sunken streams, springs, fens, ponds, quicksand, just about anything. If you ever take a drive in the country up near Bowling Green, you'll see the drainage ditches are like 20 feet deep along these country roads. That's because that's how deep they had to cut them to drain the land for agriculture. So it wasn't the easiest place in the world to get to, but you could. There was a path from Detroit, from Pittsburgh to Detroit called the Great Trail, which predated the French and Indian War, and probably was an old Indian trail from long ago. And it crossed the Maumee River right near Fort Meigs, and that's the first place west of Lake Erie that you could actually get around the lake, so it's a very strategic point. Then you could go on up into Detroit, up into Michigan territory. There's also General Hall's Road that he built. He came up the Miami River to Urbana, and then came cross country, and he got up to about Findlay, built a blockhouse. Then he moved on up to around North Baltimore and got into the swamp in serious condition, and he had to build a road for himself. He built what he called a corduroy road, so he could go on up towards the Maumee River and up to retake Detroit. That was the point of his mission, which failed miserably, as we saw. This is what a corduroy road looks like. It's cut through the wilderness. It's just small logs set side by side by side. And the thing is, once you get someplace where they start sinking, you have to keep piling up more logs and more logs until finally you have a substantial road. Even at that, it's not a very, you can't imagine, hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers, pack animals, cannons, wagons, and everything making their way through a swamp on a road like this. It was quite a feat. There's another way to get to the Maumee Rapids, and that's what they call the St. Mary's Trail, where you come up the Great Miami River to about Piqua, go across country to around Wapakoneta, get into the St. Mary's River, you end up in Defiance, and from Defiance you can come down the Maumee River to where you need to be. Another way, which is what has more to do with where we are right now, the Petersburg Volunteers came through this part of the country. Franklinton was used as a staging point during the War of 1812, that the officers stayed in Franklinton. The enlisted men, the horses and stuff, all were camped out on the high side of the Scioto River, basically from about City Hall to about where we are now. And so this, at one time, when this was just a howling wilderness, this was a staging area for the Army. And eventually they would march up what is now High Street, 23, first through Worthington, and then on to Upper Sandusky, and then on to the Maumee Rapids, where Fort Meigs is built. Petersburg Volunteers weren't drafted. They weren't regular Army either. They decided that they wanted to do their part, as their fathers and grandfathers had done during the Revolutionary War, to serve their country. So these were all landed gentlemen, that they didn't have to be in the Army. They didn't have to do this, but they wanted to do it because they saw it as their civic duty. And they marched from Virginia, starting somewhere around Petersburg, and on the 15th of October, made their way to Point Pleasant, and by the first week of December, they'd made their way to Chillicothe. They camped out there for a couple of weeks, were feted by the people of Chillicothe as saviors and deliverers. And then the day after Christmas, they marched north. And as one would say, Alfred Lorraine, who I'll quote in here, the Indian summer and their Pawa days, they found, were far behind them as they marched through what was now Pickaway County. They hit a great northwestern storm, and everything dissolved before their very eyes. So they made their way to Franklinton, camped out here for a little bit, and then on about the second week of January, they started north. Finally made their way to Upper Sandusky, and after the rain writes, we left Franklinton in its radiant glory. Does anybody know what that means? About lunchtime. That's just the way they wrote in the 19th century. Through the most intolerable roads and severe weather, we reached the town of Delaware, Ohio. Even then, a handsome village, the ultimate Thule of civilization as far as our route was concerned. Ultimate Thule is an old medieval word which means civilization is behind you, there's nothing ahead of you except monsters and howling wolves and uncivilization. We passed only one cabin between it and Sandusky. The plains of Crawford presented nothing but a wild waste of crusted snow through which we marched with excessive labor. So these were city folks. These weren't Army guys. These were just guys that decided they wanted to help the Army at that time. So they were marching through there. And if you've ever ridden up Route 23 in the wintertime, I can't imagine walking along that road. Even in July and August when I'm driving up there, it makes me cold thinking about these guys marching through the snow across that featureless plain at that time. So they made their way to Upper Sandusky, camped there for a while. Finally, Harrison decided he needed them at the Maumee Rapids where he's building Fort Meigs. And so they marched out and found Old Hull's Trail, made their way to the Corduroy Road, and made their way on into Fort Meigs. Of this Corduroy Road, Lorraine writes, it was an extraordinary structure, not modern, but of the Gothic order. Now, Gothic doesn't mean that they had black hair and white pancake makeup. Gothic is referred to barbarian as in the Goths and Visigoths. For most of the way, the rails had been routed in disorder by the swales and scatters in every direction in various forms, angular and triangular, vertical and horizontal, visible and invisible, so that their ankles at times appeared to be extremely loath to acknowledge our footsteps. Old General Hull came in for his share of blessings. General Winchester, too, is not forgotten, the people that started all this. So he said that he had heard about this Corduroy Road, and nothing ever, he never heard of it in anything except the most foulest of terms, that it really wasn't any sort of a yellow brick road, that it was probably more of a hindrance than it was a transportation route. But they seemed to be able to persevere and get through. They talk about marching on this Corduroy Road, that they're following 150 pack animals and wagons, and so that they're marching through a mixture of mud, snow, ice, and water with a consistency of mortar about knee deep. And every once in a while they'd step off some place where they thought they were on terra firma, and they'd be up to their waist in water. Now you're talking about walking up there in January and February, following all this. They did things like sleeping on logs and sleeping in trees and anywhere they could so they didn't have to sleep on the ground. So this is where they ended up, Fort Meigs, about 10 acres in size, big log fort. And it had a wall made of posts cut from the forest. They were about 10 feet high, and then above ground, and then about another 3 or 4 feet down into the ground and pointed on one end. Then to augment this, they made gun platforms where they put artillery. They built blockhouses to act as sort of headquarters for the Army and supply places and that sort of thing. They had a couple of bomb proofs, which were basically cabins that they bury in the ground, and that's where they keep their gunpowder. Because the British would end up putting cannonballs when they started sieging the fort. They'd put a cannonball in a furnace until it glowed red hot. Then they'd shoot it into the fort, and hoping that it would find the powder supply. So they had to bury the powder underground to keep from exploding all at one time. They had a well, so they didn't have to go out for the water. And then surrounding it was a big rammed earth embankment to absorb any artillery balls or artillery shots that came their way. And this is what it looks like. You stand at the river, you can see the blockhouse here, one of the reconstructed blockhouses. This is what it looks like to the other side. Now, I would imagine that in the day that earthen embankment came up higher on that wall. But if people want to see a fort, they don't want to see an earthen wall. They want to see something that looks like a fort. But they were meant to absorb cannon shot as they came over and fired at the fort. This is what it looks like on the riverside, up on this high embankment. Now on the inside, every fourth or fifth log was dropped so that an infantryman could stand there with his musket and fire at somebody that was trying to take on a frontal assault. These were the guns of the days. The Americans had 18, 12, and 6-pounders. The British had 24-pounders, courtesy of General Hull, who left all his cannons in the fort when he surrendered. So they just hauled them down the river and used them to shoot back at Fort Meigs. They also had these things, howitzers and mortars, and they shot a whole variety of iron at each other, both the Americans and the British. Typical solid cannonballs, a grape shot, grenades, something called carcasses, which were sort of these flimsy structures that were filled with a mixture of tallow, beef fat, sulfur, nitrates. So basically, once it hit and exploded, you couldn't put it out. The ancient people had stuff called Greek fire, which served the same purpose. And they had one other type of instrument, is these exploding bombs. Now these were shot out of these mortars and howitzers. And when you hear the national anthem about the bombs bursting in air, this is what they're talking about. That hollow hole, that hole was filled, the ball was hollow, about an inch or an inch and a quarter thick, filled with gunpowder. A lot of times they put pieces of buckshot, chunks of chain, nails, anything in there. They put a fuse in there, light the fuse and shoot it out of the gun. And instead of shooting it across to hit a wall and knock it down, they shot these straight up in the air, sort of like one of my golf shots. And when it got about 300 feet above the fort, it would explode, and all this cast iron would come at you about 350 or 400 miles an hour. And they were pretty deadly when they worked, but they didn't always work. This is what a reenactor's mortar looks like. This is a shore battery, and shooting the mortar shot right there. So you see it takes this high parabolic curve and explodes ideally when it's over top of the fort. Like I say, they didn't always work so well. But Eleazar Darby Wood, captain of the U.S. Army Engineers, wrote, "The camp is judiciously chosen by Harrison and Captain Gratian of the Engineers, and fortified with blockhouses, batteries, and palisades in such a manner as to stand the test of British artillery." So that was a pretty accurate description. And reading the accounts of what went on in the War of 1812 from the same kind of stuff that went on during the Revolutionary War, you find out that the people, at least in the Army, had their jump in literacy was exponential. That everybody was writing and everybody was giving these detailed, almost fanciful accounts of highly detailed accounts of what took place there. Captain Wood, who was the namesake for Wood County, by the way. So what's he have to do with the Statue of Liberty? Well, he was the first graduate of the military academy at West Point to be killed in battle. And so, to honor him and his sacrifice, the Army built a fort at the mouth of New York Harbor called Fort Wood. It's one of these star-shaped forts. That's Fort Wood right there. When they're looking for a place to put the Statue of Liberty, Fort Wood wasn't being used anymore, so it became the plinth for the Statue of Liberty. So we have a little bit of Ohio holding up the Statue of Liberty. Well, the first siege of 1813, the Americans knew the British were coming, the British knew the Americans were waiting for them. The British also knew that the enlistment terms were being expired, and so that they had this narrow window where they wanted to take Fort Meigs and destroy the American army before they could be reinforced. And so it's sort of like a chess game to get everything in order. And to pull this off, the British wanted to take Fort Meigs, and the Americans were vowed that they wouldn't do so. Here's the cast of characters: Major General William Henry Harrison, Commander-in-Chief, Army of the Northwest, who became our 9th president, and his living testimony is why your mom was right when she told you don't go outside without a hat when it's raining. He was elected president, gave this 2-hour inauguration speech in the rain, and died about a month later of pneumonia. Too bad for William Henry. His adversaries were the War Chief Tecumseh, the Shawnee Chief, great war chief, another great Ohioan, and on the British side was Sir Isaac Brock. Well, that's the way it was planned. Now, Isaac Brock and Tecumseh were, in the vernacular today, they were sort of, they were good friends. They had a bromance going, I guess, but they understood each other. Brock was a good soldier. He wasn't an aristocrat, but he knew that if he did good service, he could go back to Europe and fight in the real war against Napoleon. And Tecumseh was glad to have him because they could talk. They understood each other. Unfortunately for Sir Isaac, and good for us, he was killed at Niagara late in 1812, and so he wasn't there. This guy was Henry Proctor, who was a sort of a bumbler. He was textbook Army. He'd never seen action in a war. He was good at drilling his men, but other than that, he wasn't a very good field commander. And Tecumseh, from the first part, didn't like him. As a matter of fact, after a while, he says he reminds me of a little fat animal that runs away with his tail between his legs at the first sign of danger. So that's what Tecumseh thought of Henry Proctor. So in late April, they amassed an army of about 1,000 Canadian militia and British regulars, and about another 1,000 to 1,500 Native Americans under Tecumseh at Fort Malden and Amherstburg in Lower Ontario. They all came down to Fort Miamis, which is a British trading post built there even after the Americans were ceded that part of the world from the Treaty of Paris after the Revolutionary War. But they used that as a staging point to move upstream just a little bit more to lay siege to Fort Meigs. And so by the end of April, they had 4 batteries in what's now downtown Maumee, Ohio, pointed directly at Fort Meigs. Now, the Americans were inside the fort and they could shoot back, but the batteries weren't nearly as big as they're portrayed here on the screen. They were rather small, and so the British had this 10-acre fort to shoot at. You could shoot it just anywhere and almost hit something for sure. The Americans weren't so lucky, and they didn't have the ammunition or the gunpowder at the time. They had gunpowder, but they didn't have the ammunition. So a rule was made that if you can return a serviceable cannonball to the artillerist that they can shoot back at the British, you get a shot of whiskey. That was the lifeblood of the Army back then. You wouldn't think that the American Army today would run on shots of whiskey, but they said that during the siege they gave away over 1,000 shots of whiskey to the soldiers returning cannonballs to the artillerists so they could shoot back. On May 1st, James Taylor Eubank, who has the distinction of being related to 2 presidents, Zachary Taylor and James Madison, wrote at 8 o'clock this day, the enemy hoisted the red flag in their lower battery over at Maumee, commenced firing with their 24, 12, 6 and 8 inch mortar. They fired at us this day 240 shots and bomb shells. And it goes on like this for about the next 5 or 6 days. And you've all been to Red, White, and Boom, and you've heard those explosions. The loudest explosions at Red, White, and Boom still aren't as loud as the loudest explosions from these aerial bombs. So it's more of a psychological feat than anything else to stay there and not go absolutely mad, which actually some people did. So they fired at Fort Meigs for a couple days, found out it was being ineffective. So they came across the river, set up another battery to the west of the fort to get sort of a crossfire going and demoralize the troops that way and get them to surrender even quicker. To stop all this coming in, they built these traverses, which are big earthen walls about 12, 15 feet high that they use sort of like in a bumper pool. When a cannonball comes over the wall, that would bounce and hit one of these traverses, and then the soldiers could all set up their camps behind them. And when they set up the other artillery piece, they were ready, and they built this one. Again, they got out the whiskey because, we're talking about hundreds of cannonballs flying into that fort every day. They gave them enough whiskey to make them brave but not stupid. So I guess there's a fine line between brave and stupid when it comes to being in a live fire situation like that. But anyways, they got the traverses built, and this is what it looks like from the air today, sort of a reconstructed view. This is that they call the Grand Traverse, is this wall here. That's original to the fort. All the rest of these are sort of reconstructions. And this is a sort of a computer-generated view of what one of these, the camp would have looked like with tents here. And it said that the soldiers were actually digging tunnels into the base of the wall and sort of making little caves. But this was a very wet, cold spring, and it was miserable, and it rained every day, and they were literally in danger of drowning in their sleep if they're camped on the ground. So they said that they would take their chances with the bombs rather than being drowning in their sleep. So they moved out into the area, and so into the general area. So this is what the camp looked like. At its most, there were probably 2,000 men at Fort Meigs, which, can you imagine 2,000 guy frat house? The place was really littered up after a while. Well, help was on the way. General Clay, Green Clay, served in the Revolutionary War, one of the richest men in Kentucky. He had a knack of looking at deeds that were executed incorrectly and finding out where people had surveyed land wrong, and he bought up all this land that wasn't surveyed correctly and became basically his equivalent of a billionaire. And he owns thousands and thousands of acres. As a matter of fact, in his will, he gave land to one of his daughters. It says that 20 or 30,000 acre tract, I don't know, 20 or 30,000 acres down along the Cumberland River in southern Kentucky. So he was quite a guy. Anyways, he was head of a 1,200-man relief column coming up to relieve Fort Meigs. So they came up the St. Mary's Trail up as far as Fort where Defiance is now, and waited for further orders to come down the river to relieve Fort Meigs. Now, because General Hall was known that he put his plans in a boat and the British captured them, he sent this guy, William Oliver, with a verbal message to whoever would listen to him. Dear sir, I send you William Oliver to you to give you an account of what is passing here. You may rely implicitly upon him. Yours, William Henry Harrison. So he took off. First he went down towards Findlay, then cut across the state and ended up in Defiance. How loud is loud? The whole way across there, he heard the bombardment going on. We're talking about 40, 50, 60 miles. That you can hear this stuff going on. Now, I live up in the north end near North Broadway, and I just sort of hear red, white, and boom. If you can hear a bombardment going on 60 miles away, I can't imagine what it was like being in the middle of it. Anyways, this was the big move down the river. On May 3rd, he got orders. He moved out, got to the top of the rapids on the 4th. It was a moonless night. The head of the rapids, he didn't have a pilot to take him through the rapids, so he waited there for daylight. Once daylight showed up, he made his move down the river. He got about 5 miles above the fort, was met by Captain Hamilton of the Ohio Militia, who gave him the plan. And with the plan in hand, he moved on to Fort Meigs, and this was the plan. I think it's John Cleese or Graham Chapman once said, if you want to make God laugh, say you have a plan. Because this is what happened. This was the plan, Harrison's. And had it been executed properly, it would have been a good plan. But it turned into sort of a fiasco. So Harrison told Clay to sort of approach the fort. About 2 miles above the fort, he's to split his men. Army commanders never tell you to divide your forces, but they did. 2/3 of them went across country, came in behind the British batteries, and they were to spike the guns, which means they take a big long nail, drive it into the touch hole of the cannon so it can't be fired anymore. They were to set off all the gunpowder there, destroy the carriages so they couldn't move the guns around, basically destroy the things, and then run back to the boats, get in the boats, come downstream to Fort Meigs and come into the fort that way. Well, something was lost in translation. First of all, they didn't have the nails, so they tried to use ramrods, which the British took out of the guns really quick. And then they stood there yelling, "Hooray for us," and which wasn't what they thought they were going to do. But anyways, the other third of the force moved along the other bank of the river and relieved Fort Meigs. And to create a diversion for all this, they sent a sortie of about 350 or so men against that other British gun emplacement on the Fort Meigs side of the river. This was accomplished by this. They come out the back door of the fort and went through several ravines and stacked up inside there. And the people in the fort were anxiously waiting to see what was going to happen. And our friends, the Petersburg Volunteers, were there. And Lieutenant Tisdale, whom Lorraine described as a wicked man, but a very nice man, whatever that is. They had many good qualities. He says, "Boys, there's nothing like a great shout when you go out there," sort of like the rebel yell, I suppose. So that when you get out there and you get into position, you give them a great shout, and that's supposed to be as good as a weapon. The New Englanders in the American Army couldn't stand the Kentucky militia because they thought that their rebel yell, was as powerful as a gun, and it really wasn't. Anyways, Harrison was even down in this ravine giving these guys encouragement. Says, "Be strong, be swift, do your job, do your duty, but don't do your duty until I'm back in the fort." So he left me back in the fort. The great shout came. They moved out onto this open plain, and when at the signal they charged the gun emplacements. They had to take 2 or 3 charges at it to get them there. Unfortunately, they were surrounded by a bunch of militia, and there's about 350 men in this charge, and there was about 650 militia and Indians waiting for them behind the gun emplacement. Lorraine writes, this is about as poetic version of a description of a battle I've ever seen. Excuse me. He wrote, "As we cleared the ravine, the whole forest was in a blaze. The continuous roar of the rifles like the long roll of the drum without intermission. The balls flew like hailstones, pish, 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 now and then rap, rap. In our passage to the woods, we became They were not slow in playing their artillery on us, but we heard it not, we saw it not, we felt it not. With a blazing line before us and a crowd of anxious witnesses behind us, we had no time, this gets me, for wayside chit-chat and lateral sally. I suppose they're going to stop and tell jokes. Those who were in the fort said it was amazing to see how the balls plowed up the earth about our heels with what little effect. Well, after several charges, they succeeded in taking the battery, captured about 41 prisoners, including a number of British officers. Uh, Unfortunately, they chased him off the battery about halfway through Perrysburg. All this commotion, however, alerted other people who were surrounding the fort on the other side, and they came. So that not only did the Americans have to fight their way to the gun emplacement when that was taken and captured, they had to turn around and fight their way back into the fort. So it was a pretty bloody affair all the way around. If you go to the Perrysburg Union Cemetery, you'll see these two divots on the edge of the ravine. These are the actual gun emplacements still there, that a family bought those grave sites and donated the land as part of a memorial to the War of 1812. So this was 2007, so they're still there as far as I know, but these are the original gun emplacements. So this is an aerial view of the area. Here's where the British gun emplacement was. This is where their line of defense was. This is the Americans snaking their way through these ravines, and with a great shout, they went out onto the plain, and the battle was joined. It's now, like I say, it's now a public cemetery, and I just wondered sometimes if the old ghosts don't talk with the new ghosts at times. Anyways, back to the other side of the river. While this was going on, Clay's other forces under Colonel Dudley land, and they move on to the batteries. And had the battle stopped here, and they succeeded in taking the British gun batteries, it would have been a great victory. But they stood around waiting, giving their war hoops, their rebel yells, look how good we are. Harrison's going apoplectic on the other side of the river. He's waving at them. He thinks that they're waving at them like, good job, good job. He says, get your butts over here. That's what he's trying to tell them. Even offered somebody $1,000 to swim the river to recall the troops, but it didn't work. While they were sitting there giving themselves pats on the back, the Indians approached and pulled the same feint that they pulled over and over and over against the American army time after time. They make themselves known in the open, and they run off into the woods, sort of like you can't catch us kind of a thing. The Americans broke rank one after the other, got into this thing, and the American column was massacred. Out of the 850 men that disembarked from these boats, barely 125 of them made their way into the fort. Many of them were killed outright. A lot of them were taken prisoners and then tortured to death. Some of them just broke into the woods and made their way back to Fort Camp Winchester up at Defiance, and the rest of them were. And then the British regulars ran along the riverbank itself and sealed off their retreat so they couldn't get to their boats. And so these Kentuckians, they grew up listening to tales their grandfathers and fathers told about fighting the Indians in the time of Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton during the Revolutionary War in that period. Unfortunately, these guys weren't Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton. Unfortunately for them, they worked in feed mills. They sold shoes. They sold hardware. They were town folk that got conscripted into this militia, and they were well out of their element by the time they got there. And like I said, the barely 125 or so made it into the fort. A lot of them were marched back to Fort Miamis, where they were tortured, made to run gauntlets, and a lot of other nasty things. Tecumseh, hearing about this, came across the river, and you can see him here in this depiction stopping the bloodshed. That his cry was, we're not fighting this kind of war. We're fighting a war against extermination, not a war for plunder and booty and grandizing ourselves. And he's credited with saving several dozen, probably, American lives that would have probably been lost by torture and other things. So Tecumseh was a very complicated man. Well, the British broke off the siege. The government had told them this is going to be a quick war, lots of plunder. You'll get rich and be back before the wars even started. You'll be back so soon. The Canadians had to get back and plant their fields and that sort of thing. And so they said they wanted to go home. There wasn't no plunder. There wasn't any riches to be gained, so they wanted to get out of there. The Indians didn't like British warfare. They wanted to storm the fort and take it that way. That Proctor had told Tecumseh that he would give him William Henry Harrison as a present if they took the fort, and that his brother, the prophet, would get the state of Michigan. Now, being a person named William Henry, I'm sort of glad that William Henry Harrison did get handed over to Tecumseh, but this part about giving Michigan back, well, that's up for debate. Anyways, the siege was over after about the 5th or 6th of May, and they took their time getting out of there, but by about the 10th of May, everything was gone. The British came back at the end of July. They didn't have artillery anymore because they put all their artillery on boats, because by that time the War of 1812 in the Northwest became a naval battle on Lake Erie, and so that they needed the guns on these ships, so they didn't have the artillery they had the first time. So what they did was approach the fort, and then give this great fake battle, this mock battle, thinking that they could draw out the Americans out of the fort, that the supply column was being attacked, and as soon as the Americans came out of the fort, the Indians would rush the gates and capture the fort that way. By then, Harrison was gone, and Green Clay was still in charge of Fort Meigs. He knew that there weren't any support columns underway. He knew that this was a big ruse, and muttered something like, "If they have so much damn gunpowder, let them burn it up." Green Clay, by the way, is a complicated man. These stories of back in the day, the people that are in these stories are much more interesting. I think their stories are much more interesting than the stories of the battle. That Green Clay, like I say, was one of the richest men in the state of Kentucky. He had two sons, Brutus and Cassius. I don't know what happened to Brutus, but Cassius became an abolitionist. And when Green Clay died, he got all of Green Clay's wealth. And among his holdings was a fellow by the name of John Clay. The slaves often took their master's name. He had a son who had a son named Cassius Clay, who had a son named Cassius Marcellus Clay, who we know as Muhammad Ali. So when he changed his name to Muhammad Ali, he says, "I don't want the name of no slave master." And this is the fellow he's talking about. The other Cassius M. Clay, I'll call him, he became involved. He's an abolitionist. He became a big person, a big celebrity in the Republican Party, and that in 1860 he was nominated by acclaim to be president or run for president, and he deferred to Abraham Lincoln. And so when Lincoln was elected, he made him ambassador to Russia, and he's the one that was the architect of buying of Alaska that William Seward takes all the credit for. So these guys are quite interesting. So the British failed at taking Fort Meigs the second time, so they moved down the river to capture low-hanging fruit, as they say, Fort Stevenson, which is where Fremont is today along the Sandusky River. It was commanded by this fellow, Lieutenant George Crone, who was 22 years old at the time. And the thing is, they didn't have a big war between the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, so they had all these. If you were an officer in the Army, you were old and decrepit, or you were a young upstart, and that's who he was. Now, he had a good pedigree. His two uncles on his mother's side were named George Rogers Clark and William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And then his great uncle on his father's side was also named George Crowan. And if there's a fellow in this country that can be blamed as starting the French and Indian War, that's George Crowan. So he had quite a pedigree as far as being a dangerous man. Harrison told him to quit Fort Stevenson. He wouldn't do it, so he was stuck there defending the fort. He had one cannon. He said that he would defend it to the end. The British attacked. They did bring their scaling ladders to go over the wall. What they did was they brought some axemen. The fort was so flimsy they thought they could chop their way through. They took the cannon, put it in a port, fired the cannon at the British, and killed about 100 of them outright in about 10 seconds. The British looked at them, their jaws dropped. The Indians looked at them, their jaws dropped twice. He said, "We don't want any more of this." So Fort Stevenson was saved. Perry's victory on Lake Erie sort of secured the Great Lakes. We got the British out of there. As a result, Fort Meigs wasn't needed anymore, so they reduced it down to this little 1-acre fort. Still had a gun battery, but they needed to protect the rapids and the Maumee. They took the battle to the Canadians and the militia, or the British up in Canada. James Johnson took on the British with the mounted cavalry and sort of subdued them. His brother Richard Mentor Johnson took on the Native Americans, and he was the one that was credited with killing Tecumseh. His coat was shot up, and he said he had one shot left in his pistol, and he was sort of ready to pass out in his saddle. The gun went off and it happened to kill Tecumseh. I don't know if it's true or not. It makes a good story. These two guys were politicians and everything else in between. And they were part of a big family that controlled politics in the Mississippi River Valley in the years before the Civil War, sort of a cross between the Kennedys and the Corleones, I guess. But they had everything from federal judges to Richard Johnson became vice president under Van Buren. James Johnson was a senator. He had a federal judge in the family. They had the largest plantation owner in Louisiana. And then the daughters married well into high status families as well. Well, this is what Fort Meigs looks like by the early 20th century. And you can't see it, it's because it's not there. And this is where it would be. and there's not much left of the fort. You got a monument there to the people that served there, and it's sort of like a roadside park. The old fort is here, the little fort, and the rest of it is, you can see that the highway into Perrysburg goes right through the fort. So when they reconstructed the fort, they moved the highway out of the way. And here's the Grand Traverse that's still there after the only remnant of the original fort that's still there. And you can look, aerial photograph, you can still see the little fort, sort of a shadow of it, down in this corner, but it's all pretty much obliterated. Now, it was at that time until about 10 or 12 years ago, if you wanted to go to Fort Meigs and see what's going on, you had to come in and park out here in the parking lot. Then you went to an exhibit in this blockhouse, went to another exhibit in this blockhouse, stopped at the Grand Battery, walked over here to this blockhouse and found out that it was actually a storage house. And then if you needed to go to the restroom, you had to go over here. It wasn't a very visitor-friendly place, as they'd say. And these walls are still like 10, 12 feet high, and you can't see across the ground from one side to the other. So it's not easy to get around in there if you don't know where you're going. So they decided, back when the state of Ohio actually had money, that they're going to build a visitor center there, and they're going to put it out here off the parking lot. And so previous to building it, they were looking for relics and artifacts and features belonging to the time of the siege. What we were looking for were these things, these trash pits called sinks that must be dug on the outside about 100 yards from the pickets, 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep, for the use of the troops during the day. Most of these are sanitary type things, but they're also throwing waste bones, garbage, everything else, stuff that archaeologists get and that sort of thing. So this is what we were hoping to find, but unfortunately we didn't look in the right place. We did find a few things we were doing there. We found cannonballs, that sort of thing. And we found this guy. This is one of these artillery bombs that buried itself in the mud and then went off and burst into these several pieces. And we were able to recover all the pieces, and it's now put together in the museum there at Fort Meigs. There's sort of like a rule in archaeology that when you think everything's done and finished and you get ready to go home, that's when you make your best discovery. So we'd left for lunch, and when you find the piece of iron in the ground, it's sort of the same color as ground. Once it dries out, it gets to be this bright, rusty orange. And so we pulled into the parking lot, and one of the guys that were working with us says, "I think I see another artillery bomb or cannonball across the way." I said, "We'll go pick it up." So he went over, he says, "It's not a cannonball, it's a horseshoe." He says, "We'll pick up the horseshoe." He said, "Well, it's 2 horseshoes." Pick up 2 horseshoes. He goes, "I can't, the horse is still wearing them." So this is what we ended up with. Now, this place had been farmed for a long time, at least this portion of the fort site. And so here's the ankle bones to the horse, and here's his head. Now, was this just an old plow nag that got killed or died, and the farmer buried him there? We didn't know for sure exactly what it was. We weren't going to waste our time digging up an old plow horse. So we were digging around a little bit, and this is Steve Beal, who first saw the iron he thought was a cannonball, became horseshoes. What he's holding in his hand is a U.S. button from a uniform for the War of 1812, what they call a general service button. And this is underneath the horse, so there's no way that button could have got there other than the fact it went into the ground at the same time the horse did. And so we knew we had something different, if not special, about what was buried there. So we started uncovering the horse skeletons, and I eventually had to get out my calculator to figure out just how many legs a horse has, because it seemed we had an abundance. I remember the horse's head is still up here someplace. What are all these legs? So finally, it took us 2 weeks. We started on about the 20th of June, and by the 4th of July, we were finished. This is what we ended up with. These 2 horses buried, facing each other with their necks crossed, their legs dingled, and a bunch of other things. So there's a lot of effort went into burying these horses. We tried to get these kids from the Bible camp at the church next door to give them names, and they kept coming up with names like Chad and Dustin, which I didn't think were appropriate, so we just called them Big Horse and Little Horses. In fact, the one was noticeably larger than the other. This is what the legs look like. Big Horse, you can see that from the horseshoe here, that it's got these big caulks on there, these big cleat-like things, that this is a workhorse. It's meant for pulling a load. This isn't a horse that runs. It's a workhorse. And one of the shoes was missing, and we found underneath it a nail that looked like perhaps the horseshoe had been pulled off the hoof, and the nail dropped there. This is the front leg of Little Horse, and it was missing a shoe as well. And we found the horseshoes laying there, so they had also taken a horseshoe off this horse. So they'd removed two shoes, one from each horse. You know, they didn't need the horseshoes because they just didn't need them. They had plenty of that kind of stuff. So the plot thickens, as they say. So how did they end up there? Well, this is the front leg of Big Horse. And if you look at this leg over here, this is the proper alignment that comes through. This is the other leg. You can see that it's turned about 90 degrees. That this thing had not only had suffered a fracture here in the distal radius of the leg and twisted towards the inside like that. Having actually suffered an accident like that, I know what it felt like. Poor horse. Anyways, so you can see that this horse leg is totally displaced a little bit, 90 degrees to one side, to the outside. This is the kind of things they put down horses for horse races. So you had that fracture up there. He also had a hairline fracture and the metatarsal, the metacarpal. Anyways, so this horse was bound to have been put down, and looking at it later, he may have even had a broken neck. I don't know for sure.